So, Aaron, there's no relation to Charles, right?
I've only heard that joke once before. Virtually every customs officer. Not so much now, because time has elapsed.
Okay.
And my hair is somewhat shorter than it used to be.
You're the father of Marilyn, I guess, Marilyn Manson.
No, that in Google, you thought, there's only about 4 Google entries for Aaron Manson, and the rest are Marilyn.
All right, let's move on from the ridiculous back to the sublime. So the plan in our final stretch, and we'll end when we end, is threefold. The first is, I don't know, Elizabeth Lash Quinn, if you're still with us. I'm sure you're not against us, but I'm not sure you're with us. But if you were, I would love it if you would be able to speak a little bit about Christopher Lash. If not, I'm going to see if anyone here can speak a little bit about Lash and his intellectual and otherwise relationship to Philip Rieff. But first, we're going to finish with Rod's session, getting back on Philip Rieff, because we did stray, productively stray, but stray nonetheless. And with Jerry and Bob and Alan, return to the kind of Rieffian relevance to the contemporary condition. Then we'll sort of move to Lash, and then we'll conclude. I've asked David, as David, you may know, has a book coming out later this year based on a bunch of writing he has done, aphoristic and otherwise, in some sense extending his own father's idea of the therapeutic culture to what he has dubbed the traumatic culture. And I'd like to end with that discussion. So first, Jerry, please, over to you.
Okay, I actually am going to bring in Kit Lash. But, so I want to say a little bit to contest the antipathy of the Rieffs, father and son, to the market, or AKA consumer capitalism, which I think is both a great thing and is compatible with commitments to particular institutions. Indeed, thanks to my iPhone, which I brought with me from the United States, in which somebody made some money off selling to me. Yesterday afternoon, I spoke to my mother in Canada for free, and then last night I spoke to my wife in Silver Spring. I just got an email with an article sent to me by my daughter-in-law. All of this I didn't pay for. Now, I know I pay for it indirectly through advertising and so on. That's fine with me. And all of these help me to implement my desire to be committed to and in touch with my family, which is a social organization which I have commitments to, which helps give me some sense of identity, and I help give them a sense of identity. It's not the only institution to which I'm committed and through which I express my commitments in part through my market preferences. And consumer capitalism has been great in terms of the education of my children and grandchildren. My cinematically oriented son is now educating his 12 and 9-year-olds in some of the great films from the beginning of film through the late 20th century. So it's a tremendous cultural resource, and he can do so for almost nothing. So consumer capitalism has a lot to be said for it, but, and here we get to Kit Lash. So 30 years ago, I was on a panel conveyed by Richard John Newhouse with myself, Kit Lash, and Peter Berger on the topic of to what degree is capitalism compatible with some degree of cultural conservatism. And of course, Lash's position was that the market is entirely corrosive of cultural conservatism and sub-institutions in society. And my contention was that it isn't necessarily incompatible, that if you leave the formation of preferences simply to the market, then that's very conducive to a kind of expressive individualism or therapeutic individualism. But as most of the most important social theorists of the market from at least Hegel on, through Matthew Arnold and others, have suggested, a morally well-functioning market society requires non-market and counter-market institutions, educational institutions, be religious institutions, social organizations, and above all, the family, to socialize people into a set of desires and commitments that often means saying no to various things in the market. This was, Philip Rieff's friend Herbert Marcuse had a very good insight that I got from reading him when I was 15, and that is that the market is made up of people, in part, trying to sell you stuff that you don't need. And in order to get it, you may have to give up a good deal of your freedom and creativity. John Paul II wrote something very similar in some of his encyclicals, and indeed it's a source of wisdom. But it's perfectly compatible with having a market economy, or AKA consumer capitalism, neoliberalism, use whatever epithet you want for it. But it does require strong non-market and counter-market institutions. So in that sense, Rieff's notions are, I think, compatible with consumer capitalism while calling attention to the potential and very real dangers within consumer capitalism. And that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jerry. That was great. Kit, of course, is short for Christopher to those who knew him. Bob, please.
Yeah, I knew Christopher Lasch well, and I wanted to just talk very briefly about his relation to Rieff. He was much taken with Rieff right at the moment that I was in the 60s, and we were in touch at that time. And as I think everybody here knows, he wrote about Rieff. He not only alluded to Rieff frequently in his late books, in several of his late books, but he actually devoted several pieces to Rieff. And there are interesting cautionary notes embedded in those late essays of Christopher Lasch on Rieff. And I wanted to just note them. We could talk about them or not, but we wanted to bring Rieff back into the conversation. So number one, Lasch asks, following Rieff, how do we identify the superior and trustworthy characters in whom are deeply embedded the essential interdicts and a sense of the sacred? How do we know them? Do we know them in the cultural arena? Do we know them in the political arena? How do we identify them? And this is a question that Kit, Christopher Lasch, wrestled with all the way through his late years. He asserts that it's important, and this follows Rieff, not to make tolerance a supreme virtue. Tolerance of everything is not a virtue, but of course there is the question, how do you navigate that? How do you determine which things not to tolerate? Are they things which are flagrantly disgusting, or are they other things that ought not to be tolerated? And in this, Kit and Rieff and Herbert Marcuse were very invested in that question, the question of tolerance, liberal tolerance, liberal intolerance. one element in Lash's critique of Rieff, of the late Rieff, was what he called the danger of distinguishing, the necessity to distinguish between faith and the institutions by which faith is transmitted. And that was a sort of a critical aspect of Christopher Lash's concern as he sort of grappled with the late work of Rieff. One term that Lash used was the spurious air of sanctity that is often ascribed to institutions which, in fact, in their nature, don't deserve to have any air of sanctity ascribed to them. Again, the danger is the confusion between faith and the submission to a moral law that we make for our own governance. That's sort of Lash's language. The one other thing I will mention that that I often talked about with Lash, and which I actually wrote about in a long essay I wrote about Lash on the 25th anniversary of the culture of narcissism, was Lash's, and this is only tangentially related to Rieff, was Lash's sense that the moralities that we require, that we need to bring back, are to be found to a considerable degree in the uneducated, the unwashed, the masses. That was something that Kit deeply believed. He wrote about it quite often. And as a person who comes from that world, myself, I resisted it. I always resisted it. I didn't feel that the people in my own world were describable in those terms, that they were themselves emblems of the moralities we need to return to. I don't think Rieff, so far as I know, ever argued quite that. That wasn't an aspect of, yeah.
He was once commented in an article, once compared him to being an ally of Archie Bunker.
Of Archie Bunker.
And
That's
he said,
yeah.
I welcome that comparison.
Ah, well, lovely.
To the extent that Archie Bunker has not yet had his morality evaginated, I welcome Archie Bunker as an ally.
There's something perverse about that, since the morality of Archie Bunker is hardly what you call something that one would...
We might need to explain Archie Bunker, but we'll do that later.
Yeah, I'm trying to explain.
Don't forget the Bulgarians in the room.
You know, if I can quote from a piece from 1990. Christopher Lash died, I think, in 95 or 96, so a decade before Philip Rieff.
94.
94, it's still,
Valentine's Day, 94.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth. But he wrote in a review that I'm sure Philip Rieff read, he wrote, "We need institutions and the interdictions, God knows, but they are not in themselves sacred. Submission is not faith." So let's turn, please, to Alan, and then I would welcome Elizabeth for you to come in kindly. Alan, please.
Let me attempt to bring us back to some of Rieff's writings, which you may or may not find helpful. First of all, there is a reference actually in Fellow Teachers to something to the effect of "God protect our hard hats." There's a few phrases there where he praises the working class. But I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that Rieff wrote a relatively late article called "The Cultural Economy of Higher Education," which is republished in Imber's Fellow Teachers, in which he compares the Marxist diagnosis of capitalism and Weber's diagnosis. And the point he makes is that both of them agree that capitalism is detrimental to notions of the sacred, to sacred institutions. So you can take that for what it's worth, but he does have a lengthy article in Fellow Teachers. What I wanted to focus on for just a moment is a theme that runs throughout Rieff's work, which focuses on what I would call totalitarianism, soft, hard, be it what it may. Initially, in his early writings, he talks about the separation of belief from action. I mean, it's a very interesting piece on George Orwell, in which he talks about the separation of belief from action. But later on, especially in Fellow Teachers, he talks about guiltless totalitarians. He talks about, he quotes Hannah Arendt. He talks about the fact that totalitarian education, the aim of it is to destroy our capacity to form convictions. In other terms, he talks about the failure of course, our normative institutions to convey ideals. So he approaches this topic in several different ways, but one of the ways in which I tried to sort of summarize this is that in Triumph of the Therapeutic, he says, look, the earliest diagnosis of our therapeutic culture may come from Goethe, and he says, Goethe talks about the hospitals and theaters becoming the institutions of the next society. And as I looked at the trajectory of Rieff's work, I see him moving from a focus on hospitals, a hospital culture, to a theater culture. And this is going back to the point I think that Susan made about her reference to drama. Because Rieff, in his later work, talks quite a bit about performance politics and the rise of actors. In fact, he cites a very famous passage from Section 5 of Nietzsche's The Gay Science, which I use as an epigraph for the second volume, Sacred Order, Social Order. But he talks a lot about role-playing and how that has entered our public life. And as I look across, personally, as I look across our public world today, I see this on both the left and the right. And this is, of course, complete with many actors entering politics. So, and the sort of manufactured drama that we see on the left and right. So I simply throw that out for our consideration. The third and final point I'd like to make is that Charles Taylor, some years ago, wrote a very interesting little book called The Ethics of Authenticity, which was then incorporated into A Secular Age. And in that, he takes on Christopher Lasch, and by implication, Philip Rieff too, for painting painting in too broad of strokes. And he says, look, he says, inside the culture of narcissism, or we may as well say therapeutic culture, there are spiritual aspirations. And he frames this, of course, in terms of his ideal of authenticity. And I'm not certain that Taylor fleshes out the ideal of authenticity well enough. It's also fleshed out, of course, in a different manner in Trilling's famous work, Sincerity and Authenticity. But I found Taylor's approach raises some interesting questions about the sort of the hegemony of the therapeutic, or the hegemony of the culture of narcissism. He seems to me that Taylor is pointing out something that may be missed by Philip Rieff and may be missed by Christopher Lasch, that there are genuine spiritual aspirations at the core of what he calls authenticity. I leave it at that. So.
All right. Thank you, Alan. Elizabeth, if you have anything you'd like to share as it pertains to your father's work and appreciation for and affinities with Philip Rieff, we would love to hear from you.
Sure, I would. I've been so interested in this conversation. It's a difficult thing to talk about. For one thing, I'm very lightheaded, so nothing will be very coherent, I'm afraid. But that probably fits what I want to try to allude to, because it's not something I think that can be put into words. But there was a kind of affinity that I found when I began reading Philip Rieff, and then when I met him in person, which I feel so fortunate to have done, very close to his death. everything, it seemed that we had known each other for a long time, and everything was easy to talk about, and it's just one of those kind of times of recognition of a fellow traveler, a kindred spirit, and and I said something about everything that you say seems to have resonance in so many different ways in your writing, and you, it seems almost as though you're my intellectual grandfather. And he said, I am. And it's just an ineffable thing to try to explain how it's the cadences of Philip Rieff's writing, the poetry of it, the expansiveness of it, the unpredictability, which is strangely familiar. And so the effect on my father was not, something that can be easily summarized or even traced. I think in some ways it's in that terrain of the inexpressible. And so I wanted to say, in response to what you're asking, Lenny, that one of the most striking things about Philip Rieff's work to me is the way he talks about inwardness. And that's something that I've written a lot about as well. And he says that we all begin in a state of incommunicability, which is why being lightheaded to me matches my theme here. And in that state, we have a kind of inwardness that can separate us permanently from one another and keep us at war with one another, in conflict or in isolation, etc. But it's culture that allows us to communicate beyond it and to form lasting relations and communities. It's the shared sense of the sacred that Rieff thought that does that. And so in thinking about my father and his work and him as a person, and then Philip Rieff, there's way too much to say. Of course, I could not possibly say, say everything here, but I wanted to, I think this one parallel captures a lot of what I see in their what's the right word? Affinity. And that is that when my father's book, The Culture of Narcissism, came out, it got a lot of acclaim and a lot of readers. But he was really deeply chagrined, and he talked about this a lot, because he felt as though the book was completely misunderstood, and that he was certain that its popularity came from that misunderstanding. Many people took it to be a screed against self-love and egotism and, people who have a brash, assertive sense of self and things. And so he wrote, much as a follow-up, including, I think there was an epilogue to Culture of Narcissism, but it was in all of his subsequent works too, where he made it very clear that he wasn't talking about people having too strong a sense of self, but rather people being absent the very resources to form a sense of self, and that was what troubled him. When you had a society full of people who were systematically deprived of the very foundations of forming a solid psyche, you had the very possibility of the worst sorts of, totalitarianism and other things, chaos, etc., possible. So he was worried about the fragility that it put people in to be deprived of tradition and institutions, inheritance, history, etc. So he clarified that what he meant by using narcissism was really the clinical idea of narcissism, where individuals cannot make a separation from the parents or the rest of the world. So and without being able to separate and understand the rest of the world is not you, the I and the not I, without being able to form that separation, there could be no basis of connection. So in Philip Rieff's work, there's a beautiful reading of Michelangelo's creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel, where he's talking about that space where God is reaching out and Adam is reaching out, but they do not quite meet. And Rieff says it's in that gap that gap that must be maintained, where the divine resides, where our aspirations for transcendence exist, that this gap must be preserved. And I don't know if this is a widely known philosopher anymore, but Ilham Dilman has a beautiful book called Love and Human Separateness, which argues that it is that maintenance of the gap between people, ironically, that makes possible love and real connections and community and all of those things. And so I think that that's one of the affinities that I see between my dad and Philip Rieff, that this gap is absolutely crucial, that what we have now is a breakdown of that gap of privacy. Identity politics does that by assuming things about other people rather than living according to the respect across the divide between us all and assuming uniqueness of each individual. So individualism isn't real individualism. It is a kind of a factory type of thing where each individual gets churned out, but it's all the same thing. And the preservation of the uniqueness and the dignity of each human being is what these scholars, I think, were these people, these lovable, endearing people, were talking about. So I know that our afternoon session is oriented toward the continued relevance of Rieff. I should just add that my father's work is also having a resurgence, and it's just interesting that both of them are very interesting, considering their connections and their affinities. But some of the reasons for this continued relevance are really worrying and distressing. They both identified this kind of sloganeering approach toward life and toward speech and toward ideas that degraded intellectual life, and this living on the surface, which degraded personal life, the collapse of privacy in the sort of let it all out, and Rieff saw that as partly what Freud helped give birth to, the cult of transgression for its own sake, the reduction of all human relations to power relations and all human expression and communication to attempts to exert power, and the decline of the interdicts, rise of emotivism, this no limits kind of approach. So they both were talking about limits and the kind of freedom for a richer, deeper kind of inwardness that comes from precisely discipline and cultural constraints. So one of, I guess, my overarching point would be to refer to Rieff's notion of the loss of gravitas as being one of the main problems of our time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I should have mentioned earlier, and I apologize for not doing so, that indeed your father's work has also seen a quite important and justified resurgence in recent years too. So thank you for that, Aaron. Elizabeth, if you're still with us, Aaron asked if there was ever any personal contact between Philip Rieff and Christopher Lasch.
The audio had kicked out for a second there, but thanks for repeating that. I just don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that, but one last thing I wanted to throw in response to Bob's first point about the question of that my father asked about how do we identify characters with a sense of sacred, etc. I think that it's sad that he was unable to read Charisma because that came out later. But of course, that's the answer to that question. And the counterpart to the therapeutic was the charismatic.
Great. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Well, we are now faced with this question of how can we read Philip Rieff today? And what we heard in the previous session was very much based on his late writings, but his early writings were very much Freudian. And of course, The Mind of the Moralist is perhaps the most important of his books. Maybe you wouldn't agree, but at least it made such an impression on the audience. Was the most influential book, had huge applauses from all corners of the academia. And there is something that strikes me very much parallelism between Freud and Rieff. Namely, Freud was instigator of the sexual revolution, and this is very important to mention. But Freud didn't like that it actually happened. And his first biographer, Fritz Wittels, also a person from Vienna, psychoanalyst, his memoirs were published very late in 1995. And he says that what happened in Vienna around 1900 was a revolution, sexual revolution in cafes. But I paraphrase, but Freud remained immune to that and was even against that. But this simply happened. And then what happened in 1930s was that a very huge group of psychoanalysts emigrated from German-speaking areas to the United States. And they spread psychoanalysis, and they opened the way for Kinsey, basically. So there is a very, very clear line leading from Freud through psychoanalysts who came in the 1930s to Kinsey and the sexual revolution in 1968. And now we have Philip Rieff, who wrote this famous book, who, of course, debated with Freud, who criticized him on many accounts, especially about religion, but who basically endorsed him, and who, whoever reads that book is likely to have a good opinion on Freud and to consider Freud a very important thinker of our age. So essentially, if you want to use Rieff to endorse political right of our age, you need to de-Freudianize him. You need to basically cut one huge part of of what he has written from him. And we just heard the letter written by McIntyre, and it was very clearly phrased there how much Philip Rieff owed to Freud. The second thing is that Freud, also something that, an ambiguity that Rieff took from him, he was considered the liberator of humanity in terms of helping humanity to overcome sexual repression. But in reality, he was not very clear. His political convictions are not very clear. He was some sort of liberal. He was reading liberal newspapers, Manchester Guardian and Neue Press, etc. But he never had very clear opinion on many things. And actually, Philip Rieff was the first who pointed out that he used in his explanations many right-wing authors, or who are considered to be right-wing, like Le Bon, and he criticized this very, very vocally. So if you read The Mind of the Moralist, actually, Rieff is very politically correct there, even hyper-politically correct for the age when he had written that book. It's totally liberal book, liberal mainstream book in interpretation of Freud. But in spite of this, Freud did not believe that humanity really had a future, and someone quoted Civilization and its Discontents as a book that Rieff very much used. Of course, it's a wrong translation into English, but if you would really want to say with the title what Freud wanted to say, it's not civilization, it's discontent. It's discontents, but civilization and humanity's discontent, because it's not about a few people who are discontents. The whole of humanity is doomed in that book. And that's one of three dystopias that appeared in the period 1923-1932. Someone referred to Aldous Huxley, 1932, Zamyatin, 1923, and Freud, 1929-1930. And they all basically prophesized the new man who would be devoid of some human characteristics, something that is essentially humane, and without which humans would be very different. But the most important criticism that Freud gave is that culture by itself is an illness. And the most cultured man, and that's what Norman O'Brien, of course, using very much Rieff, later developed, the most cultured man is the man who actually suffers in his illness the most. And so basically, this antinomies that Freud had, Rieff took it from them. You want to liberate humanity, but you think that humanity is doomed. You actually have a theory which is a guide to stopping sexual repression, but you are not yourself an activist in the process of sexual liberation. So essentially, in my view, you would need to totally eliminate early Rieff in order to, you could use something from the triumph of the therapeutic. And about pessimism, just to say that, again, early Rieff is very clear. That's the end of the mind of the moralist. And the end of the mind of the moralist is that healing doctrine are no more. They ended. With the rise of the psychological man, there are no healing doctrines anymore. And that totally resonates with the end of the civilization, its discontents. So, and then, just to say, there is another parallel line, how we can read Freud, by using Rieff or by using, for instance, Norbert Elias, and that would then lead us to Steven Pinker. So what Rieff said was that he admired Freud because he opened huge questions, not small questions. And all the questions that Freud opened and Rieff continued to work on them, they're still open. We don't have answer to a single of those questions. Is war inevitable? What about human aggression and violence? Is religion really an illusion, as Freud thought, or something more than that, as Rieff believed? These are all open questions, so basically not a single one was closed. And in that sense, I think that rereading of Rieff is going to continue, but also rereading of the early Rieff, and not only the trilogy. Of course, it's marvelous that it has all been published, but just I wanted to refocus us a bit on the early Rieff, which, if you read any history of psychoanalysis or any biography of Freud, these are the works that are still very much quoted.
Excellent, thank you. early Rieff, like the early Marx. So David, please.
Commenting, I just wanted to comment on this. I don't disagree with you that there's a very different tone in the Freud book, but I think it's at variance with those parts of his work that resonate with people at present. I can't speak for the psychoanalytic profession. I suspect that that's not what they're thinking about at the moment, or it's my impression that these issues, at least in the United States and in Argentina, which are the only two places I can speak about with some knowledge where this is happening. Sorry. But, I mean, if to the extent that that all the questions, for example, that Rod raised earlier, I do think it's that part of the work that resonates with people. That's not to criticize the Freud book, but it is to say that, in my view, at least, the trajectory of his work is steadily away from that view of things. And, I mean, it doesn't have to interest you if you're thinking about Freud and Rieff. You have no obligation to think about charisma or the triumph of the therapeutic. But I do think that to say that to the questions that this revival of interest in my father's work, to the extent this has taken place, I think it's taken place to some extent anyway, I don't actually think the Freud book plays a big role.
Earlier that it might be useful at this sort of late stage, just think about the connection between Rieff and Alistair MacIntyre. Not to go deeply into MacIntyre's work, but because obviously they admired one another. They admired one another's work. They made that very clear. And I think MacIntyre has some very important and useful things to say about the kind of culture that people who want to see a resurgence of interest in Rieff would like to see us evolve. Okay? So I'm going to read a sentence from MacIntyre. When a tradition is in good order, it is always partially constituted by an argument about the goods that give point and purpose. It is always partially constituted by an argument about the goods that give point and purpose. All right? One more. All right? The self, in any given system to which it subscribes, that, all right, doesn't have to accept the moral particularity of those forms of community. Right? It is in moving forward from such particularity that the search for the good, for the universal, consists. Close quote. That seems to me to pose, a really important and interesting question about how it might be possible to reconstitute a sacred community. If you proceed from the notion that the good inheres in a community which is open to, shall we say, disputing, right, the various terms of the good, then already you are moving in the direction of what I would call liberal individualism, not in the direction, right, of a conservative vision of the good society. And that seems to me a problem, an important problem. This is not a criticism. It seems to me a problem that Rieff's work at its best opens up, and it seems to me a problem that MacIntyre's work opens up. We did a 3-day conference around After Virtue some years ago, in 1991, and I invited Philip to participate. That's a long time ago. I invited Philip to participate in that, and he expressed interest, but he declined. It would have been interesting to hear him at that session. Christopher Lash gave the opening remarks in that conference, and this question, right, was on the table throughout the 3 days of conversation. So I thought I would bring it back.
Where are those quotes from? Sorry? Where are those quotes from?
Those quotes are from After Virtue.
You know, oddly enough, the last philosopher that George Soros ever read carefully, and it was probably around 15 years ago now, was McIntyre. Susan?
You know what page?
This is the session in which we're going to talk about the contemporary relevance of Rieff. Is that still?
It has been for the last 3 hours.
True indeed, true
Yeah, yeah.
indeed. But I just want to raise a question, actually, that Ivan raised before our last coffee break. It's been, following me in rereading The Triumph of the Therapeutic. To what degree is the culture of trauma related to the culture of therapy? I'm delighted to hear that David has almost finished, or has finished, a book on the subject. I would love to hear what you have to say, and anybody else to whom this question's probably occurred.
And we're going to turn to David in 30 seconds. I just wanted to make sure, Rod, based on the comments, since if there's anything you wanted to add.
No.
Okay. Is there anything else anyone wanted to add as it pertains to Christopher Lash? Okay. Well, then our sort of final segment of this august day will be with David and his extension, logical or otherwise, of the therapeutic and to the traumatic.
Well, thank you. This sounds much more, how should I put it, much more, that I have much more to say at this moment than I, in fact, do. I've been working for quite a long time, and I really don't particularly want to talk very much about my own work, except insofar as, my father's work is relevant to it in this context, anyway. It seems to me that I've been working for quite a long time on issues of memory, historical memory, and the morality of historical memory, or rather, and arguing quite a lot against its what I view as its sacralization. But obviously, as the woke stuff and other kinds of identitarian ideas, on the right as well as the left, obviously, have seemed to occupy not only the United States and the other parts of what some people call, I think it's a useful term, the Anglosphere, but in places, for example, Catholic countries, where I never would have expected. I for many years taught part-time at Sciences Po. I taught nothing to do with any of these subjects. I taught history of development and the history of humanitarian aid. I mean, it was very much nuts and bolts stuff. It wasn't, it wasn't philosophical, or it wasn't, not much anyway. But the more that, I have gotten interested in this, and the more I looked, I never thought French universities would be having these conversations, or Spanish ones, or Argentine ones. And on one level, you could just say, well, that's the cultural hegemony of the United States for all the ways in which it's said to be a more multipolar world. That's a debatable point. But the influence, at least of U.S. academic culture, on global academic culture, and by extension on culture, that includes the philanthropies, obviously, which are, I think, entirely now functioning, or most of which are functioning under the framework of the identitarian analysis of the world. I want to put it as value neutrally as I can here, because I don't want to get I don't want to start. It's not relevant when I think of this in this context. I mean, it's not important. But you now see it in Argentina, for example. Every meeting of the Peronist Party has a trans person featured in some, either visually or in terms of making a statement. The main Peronist newspaper has a column by a trans person about, which are basically various radical trans takes on the events of the day. Now, Argentina, I understand why Ireland, because Ireland is just too culturally subservient to the U.S. and to the UK to resist whatever the background. But Spain, Argentina, Chile, parts of states of Mexico, not all of them, and so you now have this, what is now a global identitarian analysis of the world, increasingly, that transcends what my father used to refer to as post-Protestant societies, like this one. The United States, sorry, culturally, this is a post-Nazi society. The U.S., Canada, Australia, etc. But now it seems that that's everywhere, and identity is the key issue. And it doesn't, again, I want to be very clear, it's not just a left issue here. It involves nativism, for example, in countries that are not, which like Chile, which were largely had virtually no immigrants between, I'd say the 1950s and now. But now every cab driver in Santiago is Venezuelan. There are a huge number of Haitians downtown and in all the major cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that has sparked a nativist identitarianism in Chile, which is not a racially pure country. And, there are a lot of people of various races, including whites. But it is a nativist idea. We can't have, our identity as Chileans is threatened by the arrival of these Venezuelans. Let's leave it with the Venezuelans, because the Haitians are black, and there's a lot of anti-blackness in most, I would say, of Latin America, including, obviously, very much so in Mexico. So in this kind of identitarian context, it seems to me also that these therapeutic ideas, these ideas about identity, one's own sense of oneself being the source of one's satisfaction, of one's life satisfaction, is increasingly the norm. And those are fundamentally therapeutic ideas. In that sense, that to me is the relevance of my father's work, frankly. I am rather more skeptical I haven't intervened on that basis, but I'm rather more skeptical of some of the other elements of his work. For example, I find his work immensely romantic, and I don't say that as a compliment. But I think there's a lot of sentimentality in the work. For a guy who was as in despair as he was, he was also, I think, quite the sentimentalist in the work, not that it's expressed that way, obviously. But what is relevant, and I think very profound about what he did, was this understanding that if you didn't have some dominant account of the world, call it, whether you call it faith, you don't have to call it faith. You could call it simply a consensus. I mean, you could argue that China in the Maoist period, it wasn't religious faith, but there was a cultural consensus, largely speaking. There were exceptions in some cities and in the ethnic outer parts of China, but there was largely a version of the world, which was, by the way, blown up by Deng Xiaoping and by China's move to capitalism. That's when that consensus basically stopped. It might have broken anyway. And you see it, of course, in India with the restoration of a particular version of national consciousness, a very strange reinterpretation of Hinduism that is, unfortunately, I think, going to prevail for the foreseeable future, but I hope I'm wrong. But in certainly the countries that I'm relatively competent to speak of, which are basically the Americas and Europe, I think this is now, the therapeutic is now the route to happiness. So, why do people feel so bad? And that, I think, is where the next step and what I'm working on in this book. The thing that's being published shortly is aphorisms from this Substack thing of mine, where all these issues are treated, and then there's some nasty stuff about woke, which I'll probably take out, but because it's sort of cheap. But in the longer run, I have this book that in my head, I won't call it this, is called The Triumph of the Dramatic. And I think what the move is that therapeutic culture doesn't get you to where you expect it to be. And that the only way you can, as it were, be healed is if you, precisely, I think, Ivan, you said it, if you, the sacrificial lamb, are innocent. And traumatic culture, as expressed in the identitarian context, is a fable of innocence. It's outside. Eli Zaretsky, psychiatrist at, I think, the New School, has a fascinating piece in the online blog of the New Left Review, the current issue of the New Left Review, about the wokeizing of psychoanalysis. And what he basically says is, the problem here is that all of this transforms one's own struggles into one's difficulty resisting the oppression coming from the outside. And I think it's a very smart account of why it happened, but also what's wrong with it. So, again, if we still feel bad, we've worked on ourselves, remember, we've all, in this conversation, focused on, Adrian Vermeil or Ibram Kendi but we're not talking about the wellness movement in the United States, which is 16 times the size of any of even the most important of these movements. I mean, wellness is 30 million people. It's more, and probably another 40 or 50 who dabble in it. But people still feel alienated and terrible. And so that's where trauma comes in. They don't feel it because maybe it's life's condition to feel terrible. They feel it because something has been done to them. So you get, trauma culture is by definition, trauma culture is in this extended sense, an expansion of ideas of having been injured. What has happened now, however, and that's what interests me a lot. And this is, if you live long enough, life really does become extremely ironic. But it's not just the injuries, physical injuries. It's anything that makes you feel unhappy. So you get in trauma culture, and this is where, curiously, I draw on my mother's work, who's been a sort of ghostly presence in this day, which is the metaphorization of everything. Everything's now a metaphor. So, physical violence, psychic violence, cultural violence, the California state system said that professors couldn't be allowed to say certain things because it might inflict cultural trauma on the students. Now that's a metaphor. It's other things as well, but it's not being, as somebody who's been shot and spent a lot of time in war zones, I can tell you that violence is really different. But that's lost. And I think indeed that's gone, those distinctions. So we have both the triumph of the traumatic and the triumph of metaphor. And that's, I think, where we are. We also have something that's very interesting. There's social, there are economic reasons for it. The medical healthcare industry writ large, including social work, is a vast portion of the national of national GNP, and so we've also medicalized everything. So, for example, there's a theory, that there's a direct contact. You can establish that any kind of psychic trauma creates physical trauma. Is it true? Is it not true? These studies were originally done in Chile of survivors, of the relatives of people who'd been tortured, and how many generations were traumatized by this. But that too has been metaphorized, so that basically, pretty much everything that you don't like is a danger to you. And because psychic danger and physical danger are now thought to be indistinguishable, it is basically, in that sense, give the woke their due. If you believe that, then indeed expressions of certain kinds of things that make you feel uncomfortable. If it's going to give you cancer 10 years down the line or whatever, and these are claims, if you read The Lancet, for example, it now insists that basically, the public health view of the world should dominate political policy and not just on health questions, which in any case are viewed as being basically all questions. So I think that's where we are, and the comedy is, my parents should never have married and I should never have been born, but no, it's just a fact that it was preposterous marriage. They were, it was, my mother was child and my father was a fantasist. My mother was also a lesbian, again, coming back to some earlier conversations. But it's funny for me to be back in using both AIDS and its metaphors and triumph of the therapeutic in what I'm trying to do. One doesn't escape one's terrible inheritances. But anyway, it's that I think that the Triumph of the Therapeutic and some of the other work is what explains how we got most of the way there. And I think the metaphor question explains the rest of it. And that's what I'm up to.
Thank you for that, David. Susan, Jerry, Yvonne, Tyler?
Short. I can't wait to read the book. I can't wait to read the book. But let me play devil's advocate for one moment. What would you say to someone, as someone has said to me, okay, we're all getting autobiographical, one of my children. So are you saying that anything less than having been a child soldier in Uganda is okay?
No.
I mean, of course you're not. Of course you're not. But this is somebody who's very much into trauma culture. And so the serious question is, do you have any sense of where we can draw lines from child soldiers in Uganda to anything that I don't like as a danger to my psychic health? How do we
Well, sure,
start?
you make a hierarchy. If you're willing to accept that many psychic things are dangerous to health, I don't actually concede this point, but let's, for the sake of argument, say it's correct. Then you have to think in hierarchical terms, of course. And there's plenty of violence, real violence, in the Anglosphere that doesn't have anything to do with microaggressions, but has to do with go to any American city. They're war zones basically, and I'm not speaking figuratively. They are not safe places, and kids grow up hearing gunfire. And is that traumatic? You bet. But there is at least a corollary with physical violence. You haven't dropped the chain, the thread, the connecting thread. I'm not speaking English. I don't know how you say it. Fil conducteur. How do you say that in English? But at the point where you make me feel bad about myself is trauma, then I think you've crossed a line. And so much of it is that. It's, you make me feel bad about myself, and by the way, those have physical consequences, et cetera, et cetera. Here's weathering is the obvious. I don't know if you know what weathering is. It's a public health theory that says the experiences of African American people actually make them age faster and be subject earlier to various forms of disease. That's not. It's possible, by the way. But I don't think it's been properly established, although in the education bureaucracy it's taken as gospel. But sure, there are all kinds of things you could make more. You could talk about, to use your devil's advocate point, or whatever point, your child's point. We know perfectly well that things that were thought perfectly normal 50 years ago are now thought to be quite damaging. I mean, look at playgrounds for children. The obvious example. An obvious example. Playgrounds for children, when I was a child, were dangerous places. You fell off, you broke a leg. Now they're all padded and have nets, and at least in bourgeois children's parks. I mean, if you go to the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris, and you see there's this enormous kids' playground. It's all, sort of, you're walking on these, pads. And so if you fall off the high bar, you're probably not much going to happen to you. We think I don't see any reason to object to that. I'm using a comparatively trivial example. There are other examples, violence, what were things that were considered, types of violence that were considered perfectly normal and unobjectionable 50 years ago that are now considered neither normal nor, which are considered traumatizing. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I mean, I don't know whether they are traumatizing or not, but I think we see that. But at this point, if you have a society culture in which everyone's project is themselves, then anything that impedes that project is almost, is a real affront. You can't, again, I'm not interested in, I've already fought my polemical battles in my life. I don't, it makes perfect sense you would feel that way. Rod raised this preposterous decision of the American and Canadian anthropological associations to do what they're doing. And I fully agree with him that it's awful and that it's a threat to science. But I also think that's the people who protested are entirely sincere. This is not a power play. That's the trouble. I like some of Chris Ruffo's reporting, but the trouble with his analysis is everything's a conspiracy. And that's nonsense, as is his idea that, the cultural Marxists are, responsible for woke. I mean, please. But but those people felt endangered. We now live in a culture where that's what they feel. So, and you can't get around that. You can't just say, shouldn't feel that way, pull up your socks, whatever. You can't do that. It's neither feasible nor, I think, fair. That's, but then, I don't think in our cultures, I'm just speaking about the Americas and Europe because I really can't speak about anywhere else. I know India a bit, but that's a different case. But we're not going to reimpose some authoritarian form. It's not going to happen. It's just, I find Vermoil much more pathetic than objectionable. I mean, I think he has tenure, he can do whatever he pleases, but, I don't see, that these statist notions, you see it, some of the compact people share it. This is what, we've come to the point where people are on the brink of being traumatized all the time. And more subsets of trauma, that's the intersectional argument. And I don't think it's interesting to sort of say you're all faking it and, all of that. What's interesting is precisely that the triumph of the therapeutic and now I think the triumph of the traumatic has put us in a cultural situation for which it's not obvious to me that there's an escape. My own view, for what it's worth, is we're going to have to live through this. I mean, most of the people in this room will be long dead by the time we've lived through it, as it were. But that there's no going backwards in this stuff. There's no reforming it.
Hey, let's get in a few other points if we can. Jerry, go ahead.
So I want to pick up on what David said, but first I just want to quote a quote from near the beginning of The Triumph of the Therapeutic that for all I know...
Jerry, just speak into the mic, please.
Yes. A quote from The Triumph of the Therapeutic that for all I know David might want to use as the epigram to his new book. where Philip Rieff writes, "Modern society will mount psychodramas far more frequently than its ancestors mounted miracle plays, with patient analysts acting out their inner lives." So that's the quote. But now,
Good.
now to pick up, I want to just tie a couple of things together, and that is this culture of trauma. I think part of its attractiveness is that it can serve as a source of community for those who feel otherwise isolated, for all the reasons that Philip Rieff put forward in a culture that doesn't have a sense of binding communities. But that sense of being part of a larger community of those who have been similarly traumatized is made possible, and here I'm so glad that Evgeny is here, is made possible by the internet, so that you can find that people who feel violated in the way that you feel, and 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have known that there were a lot of other such people. You can reach out and find, actually, there's a ready-made community of people who feel either violated in the way that I've been violated, or traumatized by the kinds of experiences that I've had, or who have a non-binary sexual identity like I do. I mean, who knew there was such a thing as non-binary 30 years ago? But now you just put it into Google, and you can be part of many non-binary online communities. So there is this move from the culture of the therapeutic to the culture of trauma, and then it gets connected with a theme that we sort of alluded to, the quest for community, all facilitated by the rise of the internet.
Ivan?
Very much. Two things which I found very interesting. One is the problem of intensity. Listen, intensity. Okay, people have pains and so on and so on. But I do believe that part of the problem of the therapeutic culture is that there is no sense of intensity. Everything is equally intensive. So in a sense, if you imagine that everything is a mental hospital, everybody wants to go to the emergency room claiming that their sufferings are the most important and they should be treated immediately. And I had the feeling from this point of view, something, and this is the difference, you have this focus on healing and healing and so on. And even of what I understand, reading and listening to you, Philip Rieff is saying about religion, you need this moral authority. But the funny story is that happiness does not give you identity. So identity also is trauma, and you go in a kind of a competitive traumatism. It's not simply that you have a trauma, but you all the time try to compare your trauma. The other sentence is, it's me. I should go to the emergency. It's very important. I'm never going to forget something. This is an anecdote which made a very strong impression on me, having nothing to do with work or Anglo culture. That after a political change in Bulgaria, there was two members of Bulgarian parliament, let's put it like this. And one was an old woman who was telling the story of how she basically got her father, who was killed in the political police in the 1940s, and brought her home. And she was very kind of a sobering, she was kind of this. And then there was a guy, very sincerely, this is very important, saying, and listen, this is nothing, you don't know what happened to me. I was basically applying, and I was accepted to have a university education in Moscow, and they sent me to Kiev. And the story is, of course, psychologically, probably he suffered more. I don't know. You cannot measure this. But the story is that this sentence can be done, that you're going to allow competitiveness. This is interesting. One thing, this is the total triumph of Christianity in a way. All this idea of suffering and the Jesus and so on and so on. But on a certain way, it became a competition. Who is the real Jesus? Who has the biggest suffering? Which is going to do it? And so on and so on. And I found this difference between traumatic and kind of psychotherapeutic critically important. And this is why I do believe that it's a great project that you have, because it's not about healing anymore. I simply want to be recognized that my suffering is the most profound, the oldest, the deepest. And the moment you're not doing this, you're offending me.
Are you not talking about the extension of Jeron's theory of mimetic desire?
Yeah. No, as you know, I believe this is the story. In a certain way, this is it.
Tyler?
Yeah, I found that really stimulating, David. I totally agreed with everything you said, and I think particularly you raised a really great point about the sort of wellness culture, which I think is just one of many sort of self-help cultures that are ascendant. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a kind of crypto-Lacanian. I was a big Lacan person in a former life, and one of the reasons I'm interested in Rieff is the overlaps with Lacan. And one of the things Lacan says about neurosis is he says neurosis has the structure of a question, and by that he means that neurotics experience everything as a question about who they are, but especially what they should do. And Lacan says the dream of any neurotic is that someone in authority issues a demand and just tells them what to do, right? And I think a lot of both wellness, but also woke culture and anti-racism is fulfilling this neurotic desire that someone issues a demand. And I think, and the reason I was interested in the wellness point is it seems to me that the other side of what you're calling the triumph of the traumatic is also deeply related to sort of the cult of expertise and managerial expertise in particular, right? So I can defer my, health to wellness gurus and to Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop, or I can defer to Ibram X. Kendi, who can tell me how not to be a racist, or I can defer to XYZ sort of doctrinaire in order to have some kind of relief. And so anyway, it seems to me, there's a great line somewhere, I think it's near the end of Triumph of the Therapeutic, where Rieff says something like, the end of this road lies the hospital, and who is in hospitals? Patients, but also experts, and so I think there's something about managerial expertise that seems really deeply connected to what you're talking about.
Can I just ask that?
Please.
Yeah, a word I should have used, but that's very important, is there is a kind of cultural hypochondria at the moment that you would probably have to say we live in, it's very difficult to talk a hypochondriac out of hypochondria. It doesn't readily happen. I think the question of managerial culture is also management of, you could argue that it's also management of what's feasible and what isn't. Microaggressions, human resources departments can, make a policy. You get, the administrators make up a code, DEI code, whatever it is, doesn't matter. But, figuring out how to lower tuition, that's not susceptible to easy solutions like that. And so I do think there's a sort of ecology of it in some way, that this we can successfully do. Where somewhere we all know that there's nothing we're going to do to stop, all the other stuff, various fantasies of putting things back into people's control. Again, it's very important, and this is where literally the question of what therapy does, that we're talking about the one place, the woke thing, the identitarian thing, it's the one place in people's lives they have some power. You have to, you can't just write that off. People feel quite rightly completely powerless. They're governed by these algorithms they don't even remotely understand. Their political institutions are largely a joke, and increasingly getting worse, including on, Europe's still better off than the U.S. in this regard, but it's coming along nicely. When Marine Le Pen is president of the Republic, you'll see some interesting developments, which I think there's a 50% chance of happening, it seems to me, because I don't see a successor to Macron. But even if I'm wrong, the various kinds of populist movements holding increasing sway. So, this is the one place you can wrest back a little control. All the, because technology, big companies, just structures. Also, remember that another question of control is people can. I mean, it's much easier to sack people today than it was 25, 30 years ago. It's still hard.
Except in Germany.
Except in Germany. Okay, Germany is the lovely exception. I concede the point. But, you can now, people are getting around these. These laws are they're not being undermined so much by transformation of labor laws. They're being undermined by the informal economy.
Yeah.
And that's true even in Germany. I don't know, you find, the shops, when I started going to Germany, when shops were closed, they were closed. That's sure not true now. I doubt they're operating legally in the places, at least I go to in Berlin.
Rod, please, come in.
Well, I like what David was saying about how triumph of the therapeutic has become triumph of the traumatic. Trauma has become a source of gaining and maintaining power. I don't think most people really want to be healed of their trauma. I grew up in a house that was dominated by someone who had borderline personality disorder. The trauma of my relative was the center of everything, and a relative could not ever be wrong about anything. It organized the entire function of the house and distorted it and caused a lot of harm. It controlled all the discourse in the house. I've noticed having grown up that way, and I've noticed that these same things are starting to manifest politically. And when I read Chris Ruffo's City Journal piece recently about cluster B personality disorder starting to dominate our politics, I said, yeah, that's exactly what I see. We were talking a moment ago at the break about something that a European journalist told me that he observed at Harvard. A few years ago, he had just finished finishing up his Neiman Fellowship there, and I happened to be in Cambridge and took him out for lunch to find out what did you learn? What's the most important thing you learned from your year at America's top university? And he thought for a second and said how fragile the American elite are. I said, what an interesting thing. What do you mean? He talked about on the first day of graduate classes, a professor said, class today, I'm going to lecture on this topic, but we're not going to touch on this and this aspect because a couple of you have come to me and said it would be too triggering. My friend said, I and the other Europeans looked around and thought, what the hell is this? But it kept happening, and it happened the entire year. And my friend said, what's interesting to me about that is these people are going to be the ruling class, and they have no doubt in their mind that they deserve to be the ruling class. But they're incredibly broken emotionally and psychologically. He said, I'm going back to Europe next week, but my country depends on America. And it makes me afraid for the future that the sense of trauma has completely overwhelmed the ruling class. And I just throw that out there. I'd love to see what you're nodding vigorously.
Shayla, please.
It's on the same question, though I love Rod's last remark. I enjoyed your remarks, David, very much, but I'm trying to wrap my mind around something. Are all movements, protest movements at the present, identity movements? Was the women's movement an identitarian movement? The women's movement? Was it an identity-based movement? And we are also avoiding talking about race. Particularly, let's talk about the American context. My husband, Jim Sleeper, whom some of you know, has written much more about this than I have. But in the context of the experience of slavery, it doesn't seem to me to be silly to keep talking about the trauma that needs to be recollected and re-narrated and re-experienced. I mean, particularly also coming at this from the standpoint of Jewish experience, where all we do is always the time we do tell the story of our exodus and our possible, whatever next year in Jerusalem. I mean, I have to have a natural how shall I put it this way? There is an empathy and a sympathy that I have for the need to recollect and to re-narrate the trauma of slavery. This is not to say that there isn't a lot that is going on in the popular culture and so on. I'm more of a publicly interested academic. I mean, I don't follow people like Ibrahim Zandi and so on that closely. But I want to ask that because it seems to me that we have to try to make a distinction, and I think Susan has worked on this too, between movements that do have an emancipatory kernel. I mean, I consider the women's movement one of the greatest emancipatory movements of all times. We are half of humanity, if not more, in some countries. I don't know that I want to apply the language of the therapeutic, let's say, to the confusion of a bunch of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds and then sort of, I don't know, then we lose the language of what we want to do with, emancipatory tendencies. So this has been something that's been bothering me. I heard a session on identity the other evening, and I would have asked that question as well. I know it's a big one, but I'd like,
Well, my answer would be that the women's movement in the global north, and to some extent in Latin America, has increasingly turned into an identitarian movement recently, fairly recently, that it wasn't, that's certainly not what it was, but that, what's it called, the Kambachi Collective, there's some collective, I mean, that there is a turn in the ideology of the women's movement toward an identitarian understanding of this emancipatory event. About race, of course, look, not everything about woke was wrong. Those damn Confederate statues should never have been allowed to go up in the first place. So, the idea that, I mean, in what other country do basically traitors get monuments made to them after they lose the war? Because that's certainly, by the way, what Union soldiers thought after 1865, when the associations of the Grand Army of the Republic and the particular association of black soldiers were outraged. They fought and died for this, that you can have a statue of a Confederate soldier on the banks of the river. Is it Memphis, I think? I think they were finally taken down, or the Lee statue in New Orleans, or any of this. It's outrageous. Braxton Bragg was a murderer. Shouldn't have had a base named after him. And I'm very pro-military, so it's not. This doesn't come out of some defund idea. But other things seem to be much more doubtful, and I'm not sure how long. Yeah, the Jews are the people of memory, but I don't say that as a compliment, if I could put it very bluntly. I don't think all that remembering, is so good for a body. And so,
never forget, occasionally forget.
No, wait, I just don't sacralize memory, that's all. It's not a question. Of course, there'll be times when it's better to forget. I'd also understand that in the end, everything will be forgotten. So that things have, there's a timestamp on this stuff. Maybe it's a very long timestamp. Maybe it's 400 years in the case of the Middle Passage. And maybe in that particular case, some of this stuff, should be banned. I'm not a libertarian, and I certainly don't reject out of hand any change in the way people talk. We know what American college, the kind of rhetoric that was at American college campuses in the, I mean, I don't know, Texas A&M in the 60s, excuse me, pretty, go look at some yearbooks, which I did of that period, all white, of course. That shouldn't have been permitted then, and that it can't happen now seems to be fine. I don't have any quarrel with that. But it's now, any affront is traumatizing, and there's no sense, and everyone has to be pure or impure. I mean, again, the other thing is the binary. So Lincoln saved the Republic, and even if he didn't start by wanting to free the slaves, he ended up doing it. He probably didn't want to, but his statues have to come down because of the hanging of the Lakota. That's childish about power, and we are, I think this culture is self-infantilizing. That would be my account of it, which isn't particularly a political account. It certainly isn't it's all woke's fault. And by the way, even woke, parenthetically, America, there are deep cultural roots of this stuff. The AA movement, for openers, stuff like that. Kuwait, every day by day in every way I'm getting better and better, 1923. But sure, I'm sure there are. To answer directly, I'm sure there are. But it's now become the default position of everything and everyone in the culture. And that's my basic quarrel with it.
You both raised really interesting questions. I just want to say a word about Jewish memory. Sheila, as a fellow Jew who grew up in the Deep South during the Civil Rights Movement, hearing, because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, it's our responsibility to stand with the people who were slaves in Georgia. Our synagogue was bombed, actually, because the rabbi worked closely with King. So I kind of thought that all Jews thought the same way. Well, guess what? I grew up, and I realized that there are actually two strands of Jewish memory, and interestingly enough, they're both of them in Exodus, and we read both of them every year in the Haggadah. And the one is, remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and therefore we have obligations to other strangers. And the other is, remember Amalek, they were always out to get us. And, I think it's a
also
nice...
remember what God did to the Egyptians on our behalf.
Yeah. No, I know.
It's not very good.
But the idea that there are two ways to treat any of these memories, right? One is, here's what they did to us, here's what we suffered, oh God, they'll probably do it to us again, and here's what they did to us. Can we move towards a more universalist understanding of pain and justice, dare I say?
Can I throw out a quote not from either Christopher Lasch or my father or Alistair McIntyre, but a quote from my late friend Emile Ciro. And he said, I used it as the epigraph of one of my books. He said, a civilization evolves from agriculture to paradox. And I think we might be most of the way there.
So,
Back to agriculture.
I think.
Did you?
Oh, did you? No. I think Philip Rieff would have greatly appreciated today's conversation. I hope he would have. I certainly have, and I want to thank immensely everyone who took the time
Thank you for arranging
to come and participate, because I think it was a very richly rewarding experience. And I do want to say that Rod is going to write something, so if there's anything you don't want Rod to say, go to Rod now.
Hold your peace.
Or forever hold your peace. And if for whatever reason you would not like to see this broadcast to the world, I don't know how many hits it will get, on YouTube. I think it's going to be a great contribution, and so I'd like to see it made public. But if you do have any issue, please come to me, Marina, and we will figure that out. But let me just thank you all immensely for your time and words.